So I touched on a couple of things in the first video that I need to clarify. I was sworn and immunized with the law offices of Chad Cronin. I worked on multiple cases. What that means is he swore me in and immunized me as an investigator, agent, legal assistant, so that I cannot be prosecuted and I cannot be subpoenaed. Cops don't have that kind of protection. Cops can be subpoenaed. When a cop does an investigation, their shit's public. Now, when they're doing a criminal investigation, they do get to fall under they do get to keep some stuff to themselves for safety purposes, but ultimately cops have to answer to the public, whereas an investigator for an attorney-client privilege is absolute. That's a whole different ballgame. And they can do criminal investigations. In fact, in the state of Florida, the investigation that Chad launched into the healthcare fraud, my history as a child trafficking victim and child pornography victim, the Brady violations and deliberate biased misconduct by cops, the former ASAs that he worked for, assistant state attorneys at the Orange County, Florida State's Attorney's Office, Cam Mann and Karen Bankowitz, Darla Munoz-Natolo, who now works at Homeland Security, the Department of Corrections, and Bay County, as well as Pensacola PD. He was looking into their Brady violations. He said this wasn't just wrongful imprisonment and waste, fraud, and abuse that costs taxpayer dollars. He said at this point it's felony murder. Because they're Brady violations and their healthcare fraud, that healthcare fraud, what they do is they make false criminal allegations in the medical records to hide their EMTALA violations, their false claims, their DEA violations. It's basically the best defense is an offense. So to hide what they're doing wrong, it's gaslighting, where they call the patient crazy and junkie and all. And it's basically using Joe Biden's Jim Crow crime bill rhetoric, war on drugs rhetoric. It's racist. It's degrading. And Chad knew this. Chad had worked for Human Rights Campaign, and they had been independently contracted by the Department of Justice to investigate civil rights violations by cops, mental health facilities, hospitals, so on and so forth. Chad was the former domestic violence prosecutor. He was a civil rights scholar and a biased crimes advisor for Orlando PD, and based on all of the contact people have been making trying to get me back to Florida and mentioning Val Demings, apparently he may have helped get Val Demings elected because he's a campaign manager, all Democrats. He's LGBT. He was the president of the Gay and Lesbian Law Association. He's not as gay as he wants everybody to think he is. We both had big crushes on each other. Everybody teased us, said that how did we like married life and all this. I didn't just work for Chad Cronin, I lived with him. So I'm not just experiencing whistleblower retaliation from Chad Cronin and his father. I'm experiencing deadly domestic violence, and I kept trying to leave his place. I knew something was wrong. I kept bleeding irregularly. The pain was crippling. I was falling. I was also his curator and his art director for his business, The Clatch, which he actually registered with the Florida Department of the Treasury. He kept getting warnings from judges because he was going into court high or drunk, and his own lawyer told him to self-report to the Florida bar and get into a drug and alcohol addiction program. I met Chad in AA, and normally that would be off limits for me to talk about. His problem is he was a cop, a former prosecutor, federal investigator, and an attorney and a law professor who was going into AA and then looking for people to exploit sexually or for whatever type of labor, and then to cover up his exploitation in his relapse into drugs again, he would just use his political power and his police power and everything, his powerful friends, to destroy their life. Well, they already knew he had a history of this. There were other attorneys and cops and people that I met in AA who knew him, who kept saying, we've got to get you out of there. And I said, he's saying that he's going to kill me. They gave me a micro cassette recorder that was voice activated, and they had me have plenty of tapes because he was threatening all of us. He was telling me, I don't want you going to AA meetings anymore. The only reason why I was going to AA was because when I kept going to the hospital with the problems that was actually caused by cancer and sepsis caused by the untreated cancer, like dental abscesses, and I was suffering septicemia, constantly needing antibiotics and pain meds, they were saying, oh, most of this pain is just in your head, you're just drug seeking. Well, fuck, if I'm an addict to the point that I'm imagining this level of pain that's got me crippled and I'm falling down because I can't walk and can't feel my legs, I better go to meetings. Well, what those nurses and lawyers knew was that it was a fraud scheme. They knew I wasn't an addict. They knew I wasn't just drug seeking. They knew I wasn't getting proper medical care. And just so you know, the governor at the time was Rick Scott, and Chad's father's a Republican, powerful Republican, board member of Orlando Regional Medical Center. Rick Scott was the CEO of Columbia CHA. He was popped for $1.3 billion, I think, in Medicaid fraud. Never paid it back. People couldn't figure out how he managed to even get on the ballot as a governor, much less get elected. There were news articles where him and Pam Bondi were appointing people at the various jurisdictions that are supposed to do oversight so that there was no oversight on the fraud. And this was a Republican state. Now, the same stuff was going on in Missouri with Democrats Jay Nixon and the people he appointed, like Dr. Joseph Parks as his Medicaid director or MoHealthNet director. Chris Koster, who was the Attorney General, he was a former Republican turned Democrat, and it went on under the Republican governors in Missouri. It went on under the Republican governor in Arizona, and it went on in New York, them refusing me cancer treatment and making false psychiatric diagnoses and omitting evidence of cancer, to the point that apparently Cuomo and Letitia James reached out to Byron Brown. Byron Brown reached out to my roommates. My roommates threatened me. I contacted the SEC after the landlord's wife said, this is Cuomo. These guys are blowing you up because you're blasting them. This is whistleblower retaliation. And she gave me a big hug. She said, you stay in there, Jim Crow asses. She gave me a big hug and she gave me a high five and she said, you keep with it. And if you need anything, you let us know. So I actually thought about it for a minute, and I thought, well, if Cuomo and Brown and James own stock in all of United and Canteen and HealthNet and Catholic Health had just formed, they locked me up on a psych ward while they formed a $29 billion merger between Dignity, what they consider Catholic Health West, and Catholic Health Initiatives, which is the East Coast, and it's nationwide. And all of these hospital systems, I researched it through the medical journals. You can Google it online. You can look up partnership between this hospital and that hospital, and it'll tell you that they've integrated and formed a partnership. And they get these certificates through the FTC. Well, 2 weeks after I contacted the SEC, they raided Byron Brown's 2 offices. And I went into 4.5 hours of detail as to how they falsified the medical records and all the different types of scams that they run off of them. Now, I mentioned about how they were getting people fraudulently qualified for SSI and thus Medicaid under bogus psychiatric diagnoses. These diagnoses that they're using are something that you don't develop. You don't, with some of it, it may be late onset, or you have to get at least 25, 28, 29 years old, and you have to get out in the world and try to function and have regular life experiences like romantic relationships, keeping jobs, managing money, stuff like that before and you can have late onset of schizophrenia. You may not develop until your mid-20s or whatever. But you don't just all of a sudden arbitrarily develop schizophrenia or bipolar or one of the various bipolars. That is something that you either have or you don't. You get that pretty young in life, and you usually have symptoms all your life. And you usually are on medication most of your life. There have been a few instances where schizophrenics it wasn't until they got into college and they had a late onset of symptoms, kind of like you can have late onset of multiple MS, multiple sclerosis, I believe it is. You can have it all your life, and you don't really start noticing it until you get older. But for the most part, these are diagnoses that you don't develop arbitrarily. And they're diagnoses that my trauma therapist in Missouri said takes many, many months, and it takes a whole team of people to make the diagnosis. And they have to do CAT scans and MRIs of the brain, and you can't have any untreated medical issues. If you have untreated medical issues, you're going to have mood issues and behavioral issues. And you're going to have drug seeking, because it doesn't mean you're trying to get high. It means you're trying to manage the pain so you can function. And if you're in so much pain that you can't function, obviously you're going to have issues with mood, and you're going to have different behaviors. And the doctors know this. So when I say these doctors are knowingly manufacturing and making knowingly false psych diagnoses, they know they're doing it. The oversight officials know they're doing it. They know that you have to be, in order to hide, but what they're trying to say is they're trying to hide behind medical opinion, because every doctor's entitled to his opinion. But in order to actually hide behind medical opinion, you have to gather medical evidence. You have to not manufacture it. You can't just pull the shit out of the crack of your ass, throw it in the medical records. Oh, she said she slept with Elvis Presley, when that never happened. You can't make stuff up. If you're manufacturing evidence, you're falsifying medical records. That's evidence tampering. And when you're falsifying medical records in any way, shape, or form, that's HIPAA violations. When you're committing HIPAA violations, your malpractice insurance, a doctor's malpractice insurance, and that facility's malpractice insurance isn't going to pay out any rewards. That's why you don't see me represented by any malpractice attorneys. The only form of malpractice that an attorney could sue these doctors on my behalf for is falsification of medical records. That would be the malpractice. And that is a very complicated and very specialized form of malpractice, and they are mandated, because that is a felony. Those attorneys are mandated to engage the federal prosecutors, engage law enforcement, because medical records are evidence. It's actually called medical evidence. And when you falsify medical evidence, it's spoiled evidence. And that is evidence that is used in every single court, every single jurisdiction in the country, from the CDC to civil courtrooms to criminal courtrooms to determine, does the person have mens rea. It's just used in just a myriad of different ways, from the Social Security Administration to Medicare courts to it's like in the Ferguson. Another one of the reasons why they want me dead is because the falsified medical records and the scams with United that involve United, Canteen, HealthNet, and Mizzou, Catholic Health, and all of their partners, like Advent, Banner, Tenet, resulted in that kid getting killed. Well, what does medical records have to do with it? When they put those criminal allegations in our medical records, we go on a watch list. That's why Ferguson PD insisted on seeing all their medical records before they would even think about a settlement. And the settlement went from $5 million to $1.3 million. Those medical records make our lives unvaluable. So that's why they're going out of their way to kill me, to make sure this stuff isn't exposed, especially now with this pandemic. Now, the pandemic wasn't hitting at the time I got to New York. But I tell you what, if this stuff goes, goes public, the shit's going to hit the fan.